Okay, so the most visible change since last time is that we've got rid of the concentration input field and it's been replaced by this drop-down menu here. So this drop-down is placed on the new tube panel, and it's this drop-down solutions TextMesh Pro drop-down. Now, when we start the program, we're actually going to populate that. And I've done this in YouTube, which is not probably the best place for it, but you can see that I've got a reference to the TextMesh Pro drop-down, and I've got a whole bunch of components which we're going to keep track of the concentration of. And what we do is we set up a list of those components using this function here, and we set up a list of all the options that can describe how those components mix together. In other words, what solutions we're going to make. So we have a solution for water, a solution for phenol red, a solution for tris, and we then populate the drop down by adding those options to the drop down. Before we do that, we clear whatever's there previously so that we don't end up with an ever increasing list. So this drop down menu will contain these options, and these options here will contain these compounds in various amounts. And when the user chooses something from the drop down, it triggers this routine, this function, which looks at what they've chosen and then changes the particular concentration. So if they've chosen phenol red, they're going to change concentration number 1. If they've chosen tris, they're going to change concentration number 0, and so on. And that all means that we actually needed to set up a list of these temporary concentrations, and they're reset whenever we do any drop-down entries to begin with, but they were initially created at the beginning. So startup. So basically, the creation of the drop-down menu, the creation of this temporary list of concentrations that will be used when we make a new tube is all done at the moment on this new tube script. I don't really like it there. I think that it's actually something that's a bit higher level than just making a new tube. It's sort of like something that should be something that dictates the context of the experiment. And yes, we could set up the drop-down menu and everything, but the actual act of making a new tube, which is really similar to before, create new tube, this is exactly the same, except for the fact that instead of using just the volume, it's now using the list of quantities of compound that are going to be determined from the drop-down choice. So as before, this is the same, just determining what the volume is to use, but now the quantities to use are for each of the compounds. Work out what quantity to use based on the concentration that's been chosen and the volume that's been chosen. And what's now going to get passed to the liquid in the tube function, adjust volume, is the volume, and this time a list of quantities. So if we go to liquid in tube, you can see that what we have there is a list of concentrations. And when we do our adjust volume thing, we're passing in not just a quantity, but a list of quantities. Now that means that all of the things that we did after we took in a quantity, calculating how much there was there before, checking that the volume change is okay, calculating the new quantity in the tube, readjusting the final volume, readjusting the total amount. All of those now have to be done on lists. So we have a list for the initial quantities, and we scroll through each of the options, each of the compounds, and adjust them. We have a list for the new quantities, and again we scroll through each of the compounds and adjust them. And then we have a list of all of the concentrations, and we're going to populate those with the updated value. Again, scrolling through everything to do that. So everything is based on lists now, and so the major difference to the liquid in tubes script is simply that the concentration term up here is now a list of concentrations. We now have to process every concentration step with a loop to take us through all the things in the list. Similar thing's going to happen with the pipetting action. We now have to do everything with a list of aliquot concentrations. So when we do our sucking up, we have to not just check to see what the amount was in the aliquot before we sucked up, we have to do that for all of the compounds. We have to then think about what quantity has been sucked up from each tube for all of the compounds. So you can see there's this very, very repeatable structure here of thinking about a list of things rather than just a single thing. And that goes on with the new quantities, changing the quantities sucked up, changing the final concentration of each. Every single thing is based on a list. Dispensing is a bit easier, of course, because you only have to calculate what quantity to send. That's always just going to be the amount times the current concentration. So what gets sent to the tube is quite easy to do. Everything else in this script stays the same. So those are the three major changes. That in liquid in tube, we're dealing with a list of concentrations. That then means that we have to deal with a list of concentrations in pipette action, and we have to deal with a list of concentrations when we're creating new tubes. But the key thing here in new tube is we've also got this extra layer where we're defining what those solutions and those components are. So those are the major differences that we see in this new solution. Now I think that I'm going to try and take off all of this stuff that relates to the experiment as a whole, defining what compounds are in the mix, because I think that is different to the act of tube generation. And I think that in terms of customizing a solution for a particular context, it's going to be easier not to contaminate it with the idea of the new tube. There may be other things that we need to set up for an experiment. So the other thing that you'll notice is that in both the pipette action and the liquid in tube script, where we have the update of the color, we have to decide which of the compounds it is that we're going to do the color on. Before it was just the concentration of the colored compound. Well, now we're deciding it's based on concentration number 1, which in this case is not glucose, it's the phenol red. Same in the pipette action. And this is again an illustration of why we need this to not have the duplication, because if I make a change in one, it needs to make a change in the other, and that of course could be something that's monitored at a much higher level. All right, so that's good. With this is a big advance. This is huge because this now takes us into the land of being able to look at all of the compounds that we have in a tube and decide how they're going to interact, and that will of course generate completely novel data.